Okay, well, thank you, Andrea. And,
thank you. Okay, so hello. Start off with just a little bit about myself. So I'm here representing Semantico. If you don't know us, we're a digital agency. We work with clients in the academic and scholarly publishing sector, both here in the UK and in the US. We're based down in Brighton. And for the last 5 years of my career, I've been a user experience practitioner. And like most people in the UX field, I came via a rather circuitous route. So as you can see, I first gained my PhD in biochemistry before settling on design as a career. So it's quite nice to be speaking at an STM conference. It feels like I'm sort of back in familiar territory. And if anyone's on Twitter, that's my handle there, so you can follow me. But I don't tweet very often, so just to warn you. So today I was asked to talk to you about how content can influence your UX design processes. And as Tasha said, she wanted to try and make this quite a practical day, and I want to try and make this quite a practical talk. So I want to actually kind of try and arm you with some basic UX methods that maybe you can actually start thinking about and understanding a little bit more about what it is we do and perhaps use yourselves as well. And although I want to keep it quite practical, which means I've possibly deviated slightly from what the blurb says in the materials, I do think a little bit of theory is important. So I'm just going to kick off with talking about what it is exactly that we mean when we talk about user experience. So, is anyone good at spot the difference? Anyone see the difference in the background between my last two slides? Here's the last one again. Has anyone spotted it? There might have been a slight font issue. Well, it's actually so here we've got a spiral staircase, and the previous one, if I go back, there's a ladder. So both of the slides show sections of the library at Trinity College in Dublin. But what is it that caused someone to put the spiral staircase next to one bookshelf and a ladder next to another? And I don't really know the answer, but I suspect that it has something to do with user experience. And the term itself was coined maybe only a decade or so ago, and I think Don Norman, who's a design guru, kind of puts it best when he says that user experience refers to all aspects of a person's experience with a system, including the industrial design, the graphics, the interface, physical interaction, and the manual. Now, I want to think a little bit more about what it is that we actually mean by experience as well. And we can imagine experiences. They're all very subjective. They're very individual, but they're composed of these various internal and external factors. So you've got sort of external context, the time that you're having the experience in, the culture, the surrounding environment, and all sorts of internal things like your cognition and your emotional states. So while we can never really truly know somebody else's subjective experience, we do have tools and ways in which we can measure some of these things. And especially in our kind of modern interconnected world, there's certainly a lot that we can gather around the external factors. And by asking people and engaging with our users, we can discover some of the internal factors too. So now that we've sort of explored what we mean by user experience, I want to think a little bit about what it is we mean by UX design. And I know these terms are sort of bandied around and can be quite confusing, so I hope you'll bear with me when I kind of break it down a little bit. Some people would say that UX design is a bit of an oxymoron, and that you can't design an experience, and of course they're right. Just look at the people in this picture. The guy on the right here is clearly having the best time of his life. But the girl in the middle, I'm not too sure about her. And everyone here is having their own individual, unique experience right here. But what they all share is that they're all engaged with, or in this case, firmly strapped into, something that's been designed to provoke a particular kind of experience. So although we can't design experiences themselves, we can design for experiences. And that's really what it is that we mean when we talk about UX design and user-centric design. So I want to break down the user experience a little further, and we can see that it sits at the intersection of where a user interacts with a system in a given context. And unfortunately, despite advances in genetic engineering, we're not yet at the point where we can design our own users. So as designers, we don't really have a lot of control over that aspect. We don't have any control over people's preferences. But again, we can understand and we can try to anticipate these things. For example, if we do some research, we know that children under the age of 2 prefer red tones. So maybe, red-coloured toys will make small children happier. We also can't really control anything about the context that we're working in. We can't control where, why, or how somebody has an experience. But again, we can try and understand these contexts and design around them. So, for example, if we know that people on the move are more likely to be using mobile phones and tablets than laptops, perhaps, then we can design for that. And what we do have control over is systems. Although, again, perhaps as designers and individuals within those systems and working with them, we maybe have less control sometimes over them than we might like. But we can use various techniques that kind of sit in these intersections between what we can control and what we can't control. And by using these methods, we can establish various kind of design principles and guiding principles to help us kind of develop much more user-centric products. So back to the topic. I'm sure you're all wondering what content has to do with any of this. So that's what I'll be spending the next few slides talking about. So this should be looking a little bit familiar by now. And as you can see, content really is synonymous with the user experience because, of course, in our interconnected and digital age, it's really knowledge and information that we're after and that we want to experience. So I think this works perfectly well with content at the center as well. And content has its own systems and its own contexts as well. And it's just as important to understand those as it is to understand the contexts of your users. So here's a piece of content. It's an anatomical textbook. On the left, we've got the title page of the 1918 edition, and on the right, there's a modern cover. And, as I said, all content has its own context, and this changes over time. And we can see how the sensitivity to that context is kind of reflected in changing designs over the years. So as the author's name has become synonymous with the work, you can see that kind of reflected in the revised title. And, changes in print methodology and graphics allow us to produce colours like this completely black cover, for example, that might not have been possible when this piece was produced. And there's obviously lots of different types of content. So again, these are all different types of anatomy-related content. We've got a journal issue, we've got a textbook, news article, some primary source material, a children's book, and maybe some kind of multimedia content here. And all these different content types are different, and they bring with them their own kind of stories and their own unique sort of needs as well. So I'd like to kind of explore the content landscape a little bit more closely. So on this slide, I've sort of rather arbitrarily plotted a few different types of content that I sort of come across in my practice and that we deal with in the publishing sector. And I've plotted them in terms of sort of how frequently they're produced and how complex they are. So right up here, we've got things like big data projects, which might happen in real time, and they're hugely complex. You might have things like books, which take a long time to produce, perhaps a little bit more, less frequently updated, but of a similar kind of complexity. And then other things that have much more reproducible formats, you might be able to turn over on quicker timescales. So think about where your content sits within this landscape and what that means for the context and systems surrounding it, and what that means for your users that are using those things. We've heard a lot about the content production process, which is actually something I'm sure many of you are familiar with. For me, it's quite a new thing to hear about, because I'm involved in this bit down here. Whoops, where's my pointer? And it sits within this much larger picture. So this diagram sort of shows that the content production process essentially involves a transfer of specialized expertise and domain knowledge from the content producers up here through various other players to the users. And these kind of different colours sort of show the sort of distribution of expertise that you might expect. And having a user-centric design approach helps to kind of facilitate that transfer of knowledge, to make sure that it doesn't fall through any of the gaps in the steps between the different players. I think that whatever your position in the process, you can help to facilitate that transfer, and hopefully in the next part of my talk I'll give you some techniques that might help you actually do that. But in any case, I think we all have a responsibility to try and help establish those guiding principles and help transfer that knowledge along the chain in the right way. So just as an example, at Semantico, what we do, and this is sort of about also supplementing that knowledge with your own, we all are experts in our own individual domains. So at each step, there's also the opportunity to kind of supplement it. And at Semantico, what we do, one of the ways in which we help this, we sometimes include glossaries in our technical documentations, just to make sure that everybody is talking the same language. And it really is simple things like that can make a huge difference in how easily knowledge is passed along. And it's important to remember that this process isn't linear, of course. So it looks a bit more like this, where you have various inputs that sort of feed into these cycles, iterative cycles of research, design, and build around a system. And the point at which content enters the system, this point here, is all about data. And we've heard quite some good talks about that. Learned some new things just before about how that all works as well. So it's not just about transferring knowledge between human beings, it's also making sure that that expertise and that domain knowledge gets transferred through machines. So how do we actually tie up all of these different inputs and make sure that we get the right output at the end? And this is where I feel that UX methods can really come into their own, and they don't just have to stay within the field of UX. I think they're quite broadly applicable. So we can explore people's preferences with surveys and interviews, and we can observe their behavior in usability studies, and using tools like Google Analytics to do that remotely as well. But user experience practitioners also deal a lot with semantics and meaning and defining taxonomies and information architecture, which is all overlaps with sort of traditional information science. And those are the techniques that are really, I feel, most relevant to content. So that's what I'd like to kind of talk about next. So we can see that in terms of understanding the context of our content, we really need to look at things like ethnographic research and business analysis and techniques around those. And just before I get into some of these techniques, I want to bust a little bit of a myth around usability, that it has to be expensive or that it's very complicated or involved. And it really, I mean, it can be, of course. How long is a piece of string? You can make it any length you want. And it's a bit like that with usability. And this slide is shows some research from Jacob Nielsen, who's kind of the father of UX in many ways. And he shows that you actually need only about five users to discover the vast majority of usability problems. And this kind of rule of thumb actually holds true for a lot of different qualitative research techniques. And so it's much better to test often with small numbers of people. And they don't have to be targeted users. You don't have to do huge demographic analysis. You can pick 5 people from the office down the road, or down the hall. Because a lot of these usability problems, they're to do with being human and how we as humans respond rather than as individuals necessarily. So here's a few different UX methods, and you can see that they kind of range from things that are very qualitative, like interviews and contextual inquiry, to much more quantitative things like metrics. And I want to explore just 3 of them today, because I feel like these are the ones that, A, relate most to content, and also they can be used in isolation together to sort of progress through these iterative research and design and build cycles. So you can actually use these things as a sort of mini UX lab, and they also span a nice range of sort of quantitative and qualitative.
We want to leave time for questions. You only got about 5 minutes.
Okay. Try and rush through these then. So the first one's contextual inquiry, and this is really about just exploring your users in their natural habitat and their natural context. And it can be something as simple as just taking a photograph of somebody's desk. So here's the desks of some of my colleagues, and you can see immediately we can start to kind of spot commonalities and differences. So one commonality is that everyone here uses an Apple laptop, but we can see differences emerging. So you can spot the coffee drinkers, for example, here, or people who have an ergonomic keyboard. And we can start to kind of group users into different archetypes like this. Another technique that I often use is to actually just ask people to show me what they're carrying on their person. And people are very happy often to empty their bag and do a show and tell of the sort of tools that they have with them. And this can tell you an awful lot about people's workflows and their habits, and also just the language that they use when they talk about their work. And even from just a handful of interviews and research like this, you can start to develop personas. So this is Matt. He's an example of a persona that we're developing based on some research with the University of Sussex. But he actually normally looks a little bit more like this. And he's constantly evolving sort of in a corner of our office. And we're constantly adding new things to him. And I think I just wanted to sort of show you this because I think even just putting a few photographs or a few post-it notes up in a corner of your office can really help to bring your users alive and help you include them in discussions and really think about their needs a little bit more. So the next technique I'd like to talk about is card sorting. And this effectively involves people sorting items into groups and then labeling those groups. And you can do an open sort where you let people label their own groups, and that can tell you a lot in terms of the words people use. Or you can do a closed sort where you predefine your own groups and then let people sort items into them. And the outputs of the card sort look a little bit something like this. You don't need to go overboard. This is a tool, Optimal Sort. It's an online tool. They do a free kind of demo version that you can use for, I think, up to sort of 10 people. So I'd recommend you go and check it out if you're interested in that kind of thing. But you can do it just with Post-it notes and Excel spreadsheets. And what you get out is you see sort of natural clusters of where people will tend to group similar information together. And from these clusters, you can then start to build these sort of tree diagrams, and the ultimate aim of card sorting exercises is to really define sort of hierarchies, and you can use it to build things like sitemaps, and also sort of analyze your content as well. Once you've done your card sorting, you can take those outputs, as I said, and test them with users. And this is a method called tree testing. And again, you can do it with the most basic of tools, just a pen and paper. If you print out your tree structure and you set your users some simple tasks, asking where they would look for certain information within that structure, and they just mark on the piece of paper where they would expect to find it. But you can also go a bit more complicated, and again, sort of online tools like this TreeJack from the same people as the slide I showed earlier, they allow you to do much more in-depth analysis. So here we can see that, on this particular task, people sort of looked all over the site for this information that they were looking to find. But in fact, we can see that most people did find the correct route. But it allows you to do much more detailed analysis. So I hope that I've kind of shown that UX is scalable. It doesn't need to be big and scary or expensive. It can be done, it doesn't even need an expert. So I hope I've sort of inspired a few of you to think in a more user-centric way, and perhaps be brave enough to try it yourselves. And UX is everywhere. We're all users, you've probably heard that before, but we're also all user experience designers. We all design our own subjective experiences, maybe taking the scenic route home or whatever. So don't be afraid to sort of, bring that out and think of yourself as a designer.
Okay.
And finally, so content tells stories, and really it's our job, wherever we are in that content production process, to try and make sure that those stories are told right. Thank you.
Thank you. We've got time for a couple of questions, and has anybody got anything immediately exciting and burning? Oh yes, good. Say who you are, please.
I'm Jason Marcos from Wiley.
Hello, Jeff.
So the question I had was, once you've done your research, you're then going to turn that into the design part. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I've seen some experience of, and wonder what your thoughts were on this, is that in the past, the UX designer part becomes the wireframing and the page layout stuff. And they've learned techniques around understanding what you can do with Ajax and HTML and HTML5. But get them to understand what you can and can't do with the content has become a new skill.
Yes.
I think we're still playing catch-up on that, and I wondered if you see that as well, because sometimes if you're going to do that across 10,000 articles or 1 million articles, adding some new content construct is a problem. And just, I wonder if you had that experience and any experience to share on that.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, I was going to talk a little bit about content analysis in a field in its own right, because I think, as you say, it is becoming its own problem and its own thing with its own solutions. Yes, I have come across that problem myself. I understand it well. And I think, I think there's really some opportunities for sort of people, technologists such as myself and content producers to really be much more collaborative in that production process. And, we've heard about sort of common standards and common formats, and you yourselves at Wiley have Wiley ML. So I think being able to collaboratively work on things like that really is kind of the key to being able to, make wonderful products.
More questions? Yeah.
Who am I? I'm Tasha Mellons-Cohen. Do you think that publishers as an industry have really given enough thought or any thought to user experience, and really what's our next step? What do we need to be doing to work on this?
I mean, my impression is that yes. I think I haven't been to an STM conference before, but I've been to various publishing events, and there has been a lot of buzz around user experience. I've heard it talked about a lot. So I don't think that kind of uptake is the problem. I think it's, as you say, it's perhaps having the right tools and knowing when to apply it. And I think this is also perhaps a bit of a key point in that UX really, and I don't know if this came across strongly enough in my talk, you really need kind of a framework, and it's not just something that happens at one part of the process and then it's done and the UX is done. It's something that needs continuous sort of integration with everything. You need various touch points right from the initial kind of concept through to build and aftercare. So, yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but...
Okay, we've time for one more question, if anybody has one. And I think not, so we are finishing on time. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay.